do it without thinking. Someone raises an eyebrow and you begin to unpack your reasoning. A question floats across the table and you rush to meet it with clarity, with context, with justification. You were not asked to defend yourself, yet you unfold the entire map of your thinking as though transparency itself were a form of protection. This is not strategy. This is reflex. Watch yourself in the moments that follow a simple decision. You chose one path over another, and before anyone speaks, you are already building the case for why. The words spill forward, not because the choice was unclear, but because you have learned to believe that understanding must be earned, that your position in the world becomes legitimate only when others nod in agreement. And so you explain, you clarify, you soften the edges of certainty, until what began as a decision starts to resemble an apology. Machiavelli understood something that most people spend their lives resisting, that power does not justify itself. It does not arrive with footnotes. It does not pause to ensure everyone feels comfortable with its presence. Power, in his view, was not the loudest voice in the room. It was the one that spoke last, or not at all, and still shifted the atmosphere. He noticed that princes who over-explained their edicts weakened them, that rulers who sought to be loved through transparency often found themselves neither loved nor feared, but merely negotiated with. He saw that the moment you begin to justify your position, you suggest that your position is negotiable. You have not been taught this. You have been taught the opposite. You have been told that communication is the foundation of respect, that clarity is kindness, that explaining yourself is a sign of maturity. And in many contexts, this is true. But there is a threshold, invisible, rarely discussed, where explanation becomes subordination, where your need to be understood transforms into a request for permission. And once you cross that threshold, something in the social contract shifts. People stop seeing you as certain. They begin to see you as convincing yourself. The change does not announce itself. It begins internally, in a place you might not notice at first. You stop mid-sentence. Someone asks why you made a choice, and instead of launching into the familiar architecture of reasoning, you pause. The pause feels strange. It feels almost rude. Your instinct is to fill it, to smooth over the silence with context, but you let it sit. And in that small gap, something recalibrates. Your breath slows. Your shoulders drop half an inch. You realize that the question was not a challenge. It was curiosity. And curiosity does not require a dissertation. It requires only what you are willing to offer. This is the first shift. It happens in your nervous system before it reaches your behavior. You stop bracing for judgment. You stop pre-defending positions that no one has attacked. The internal monologue that used to rehearse justifications begins to quiet, not because you have become indifferent, but because you have started to trust that your choices can stand without scaffolding. You begin to notice how much energy was being spent on the management of perception, on the constant recalibration of how you might be received. And when that energy withdraws, it does not leave a void. It returns to you. It settles back into the center. The external world responds before you expect it to. You state something plainly. No preamble, no hedge, no invitation for debate. You say what you mean and then you stop. The person across from you hesitates. They were prepared for more. They were waiting for the moment when your certainty would soften into negotiation, when you would offer them a foothold to climb into your reasoning and rearrange it. But you do not offer that foothold. You do not rush to fill the silence. And in that absence, something unusual happens. They accept what you said. Not because they were convinced, but because you did not ask to be convincing. You simply stated a fact of your reality and moved on. This is not dominance. It is not coldness. It is the atmospheric shift that occurs when someone stops performing their own legitimacy. People are accustomed to a certain rhythm in conversation, assertion followed by justification, opinion followed by defense. When you break that rhythm, they recalibrate. They begin to assign weight to your words, not based on the volume of explanation, but on the absence of it. Ambiguity, it turns out, increases perceived authority, not because ambiguity is inherently powerful, but because it refuses to be diminished by the need for approval. Machiavelli wrote about this in a language most people misread. They see his work as a manual for cruelty, for manipulation, for the ruthless acquisition of control. But beneath that surface lies a deeper observation about human nature, that people project meaning onto silence, that the less you explain, the more others assume you know. He was not advocating for deceit. He was pointing out that explanation is often a form of weakness, a signal that you are unsure whether your position can hold without assistance. The prince, who must justify every decree, teaches his subjects that decrees are negotiable. The one who issues them and remains silent teaches something else entirely, that reality does not require consensus to exist. You begin to see this play out in small exchanges. A colleague questions your approach, and instead of walking them through your entire thought process, you acknowledge the question and continue. The conversation does not escalate. It deflates. They were expecting resistance, a tug-of-war of reasoning, and when you do not pull back, the rope goes slack. They move on. Later, they may repeat your position as though it were obvious, as though they arrived at it themselves, and you let them, because the goal was never to be credited. It was to move forward. Contrast this with the other version of yourself, the one who still explains. That version is articulate, thoughtful, eager to be understood. When someone disagrees, they lean in. They offer examples. They rephrase. They search for the angle that will finally make the other person see. And in doing so, they give away the center. They hand over the gravity of their own position and ask someone else to hold it up to the light, to inspect it, to decide whether it deserves to stand. This is not collaboration. This is erosion. Each explanation shaves a thin layer off the foundation until what remains is not conviction, but consensus. And consensus, while comfortable, is not the same as certainty. The version of you that does not explain does not refuse dialogue. It simply refuses to dissolve. When you state something and stop, you create a boundary, not a wall, but a shape. Others can see it, respond to it, move around it, but they cannot reshape it through questioning alone. This changes the geometry of interaction. People begin to approach you differently. They stop testing. They stop waiting for you to second-guess yourself. They begin to treat your words as fixed points rather than proposals. Machiavelli's insight here is often misunderstood as cynicism, but it is closer to physics. He observed that power functions like gravity. It does not announce itself, it simply pulls. And the pulling force is strongest when it is least visible. The moment you begin to explain why something should be a certain way, you reveal that it is not yet that way. You reveal that it requires agreement to exist. But when you state something and let it stand, you suggest that it exists independently of agreement, that it is not an argument. It is simply the terrain. This does not mean you become silent. It means you become economical. You learn the difference between contributing to a conversation and defending your right to be in it. You stop front-loading your credibility. You stop offering your resume before your opinion. You stop saying, "I think," or "in my experience," as though your perspective requires a disclaimer. You speak from the assumption that your words have value, and then you let others decide whether they agree. The difference is subtle, but it is everything. One approach asks for validation. The other assumes it. People begin to fill the space around you with assumptions. This is not manipulation. It is the natural human response to ambiguity. When you do not explain, others construct explanations. When you do not justify, they justify for you. And more often than not, the story they tell themselves is more generous than the one you would have offered. They assume you have reasons. They assume you have thought it through. They assume you know something they do not. And because you do not correct them, the assumption solidifies. You become, in their eyes, someone who does not need to prove themselves. And once that perception takes hold, it changes every interaction that follows. There is a discomfort in this, a discomfort that arrives not from others, but from within. You are used to being understood. You are used to the relief that comes when someone nods and says, "That makes sense." When you stop explaining, you lose that relief. You lose the reassurance that your internal logic has been validated by an external source. And for a time, this feels like isolation. It feels like you are holding something alone that you used to share. But what you are actually holding is not loneliness. It is self-trust. The need to be understood is not a need for communication. It is a need for confirmation. You explain yourself because you want to know that your reasoning is sound, that your choices are defensible, that you are not adrift in subjectivity. But understanding from others cannot give you that. It can only reflect back what you already believe. And when you stop seeking that reflection, you stop outsourcing the validation of your own mind. You begin to trust that your thinking does not require an audience to be legitimate. This is the withdrawal of a dependency. It is uncomfortable in the way that any withdrawal is uncomfortable. But on the other side of it is a strange, quiet freedom. Machiavelli framed this as the art of withholding. Not withholding information as a form of control, but withholding justification as a form of conservation. Every time you explain, you spend a piece of your authority. You distribute it among those who listen, hoping they will return it in the form of agreement. But authority does not work that way. It does not grow through distribution. It grows through concentration. When you stop explaining, you stop leaking, you stop diffusing your certainty across a dozen small negotiations, you keep it gathered, and others feel the difference. There is a metaphor here that Machiavelli might appreciate, though he never used it explicitly. Think of yourself as a center of mass. When you explain, you extend yourself outward. You send tendrils of reasoning into the space around you, hoping they will anchor you to something solid. But the more you extend, the more dispersed you become. The more you justify, the less centered you feel. Now imagine pulling those tendrils back. Imagine letting your reasoning exist inside you without broadcasting it. What happens is not rigidity, it is density. You become harder to move, not because you are stubborn, but because you are no longer scattered. People orbit around centers of mass. They do not orbit around things that are trying to orbit them. When you stop explaining, you stop chasing validation. You stop moving toward others in the hope that they will move toward you. You simply remain. And remaining, it turns out, is magnetic. Not because you are aloof, but because you are not asking anyone to hold you in place. The transformation is not immediate. For weeks, maybe months, you will feel the pull to explain. Someone will misunderstand you and you will want to correct them. Someone will question your choice and you will want to defend it. The reflex does not disappear overnight. But each time you pause instead of explaining, each time you let a misunderstanding sit without rushing to fix it, you train yourself into a new posture. You teach yourself that being misunderstood is not an emergency, that disagreement is not a threat, that you do not owe the world a guided tour of your inner logic. And as you do this, the world adjusts. Not because the world respects silence, but because the world respects settledness. People are drawn to those who seem certain, even if that certainty is quiet, even if it is unexplained. They are drawn to those who do not need their approval to proceed. This is not about arrogance. Arrogance explains itself constantly because it is insecure. This is about presence, about occupying your own decisions fully enough that others can sense you are not second-guessing them. Machiavelli observed that princes who appeared uncertain invited rebellion, not because their policies were wrong, but because their hesitation suggested the policies could be wrong. And suggestion is all it takes. The moment you imply that your position is open to renegotiation, others will attempt to renegotiate it. But if you state your position and move on, the opportunity for renegotiation never arises. The decision is already made. The conversation has already moved forward, and those who might have pushed back are left without leverage because you did not give them the opening. You will notice this in meetings, in relationships, in casual exchanges. The person who explains least is often the one whose words carry the most weight, not because they are saying something profound, but because they are not diluting it. They say what they mean, and then they stop. And in that stopping, there is a kind of completeness, a sense that nothing more needs to be added. Others might probe, might ask questions, but the absence of defensiveness signals that the speaker is not interested in debate. They are simply stating what is. And what is does not require defense. This is where Machiavelli's philosophy intersects with something deeper than politics. It intersects with the mechanics of respect. Respect is not earned through explanation. It is earned through consistency, through the repeated demonstration that you do not waver when questioned. that you do not scramble to justify when challenged, that your words are not the opening bid in a negotiation, but the final statement of your position. And once people see that pattern, they stop testing you. They stop waiting for you to crack. They begin to take you at face value. There is a paradox in this. The less you explain, the more you are trusted. The less you justify, the more others assume your justifications are sound. It is as though the act of withholding explanation creates a vacuum, and into that vacuum, others pour their own assumptions, almost always in your favor. They assume competence. They assume experience. They assume that you have reasons you are choosing not to share, rather than assuming you have no reasons at all. And because human beings are pattern-seeking creatures, they will construct a narrative that makes sense of your silence. They will tell themselves a story in which you are the one who knows. You do not have to encourage this. You do not have to perform mystery or aloofness. You simply have to stop doing the thing you have always done. Stop rushing to prove that you belong in the conversation. Stop preempting doubt with justification. Stop treating every interaction as though it were a test you must pass. When you stop doing this, people stop treating you as though you are being tested. They start treating you as though you are the standard. The internal shift is the harder part. The external responses are often immediate, even startling. But inside, you will wrestle with the discomfort of being misunderstood, of watching someone draw the wrong conclusion, and choosing not to correct them, of allowing your silence to be interpreted in ways you did not intend. This feels at first like a loss of control. But it is actually the opposite. You are relinquishing control over how others perceive you, which is a control you never truly had. And in doing so, you gain control over how much of yourself you expend in the attempt. Machiavelli would recognize this as the essence of strategic conservation. Power is finite. Attention is finite. Authority is finite. And every time you explain yourself, you spend a portion of that finite resource. You expend energy managing perception, justifying decisions, soothing the discomfort of those who question you. And while this might feel generous, even noble, it is also exhausting. It is also, ultimately, unsustainable. Because the more you explain, the more explanations are expected. You create a precedent, and precedents, once established, are difficult to break. When you stop explaining, you break that precedent. You signal that your decisions are not up for negotiation, that your reasoning is your own, that you are willing to be questioned, but not willing to dissolve under questioning. This is not rigidity. It is boundaries. And boundaries, when held calmly, are rarely challenged. People push against uncertainty. They do not push against stillness. The version of you that has stopped explaining does not look different, does not speak louder, does not carry themselves with exaggerated confidence. They simply stop apologizing for occupying space. They stop couching their opinions in qualifiers. They stop checking the room for permission before they proceed. And this shift, though subtle, is unmistakable. Others feel it. They may not be able to name it, but they respond to it. They hesitate before interrupting you. They listen more carefully when you speak. They stop assuming your words are the beginning of a debate and start treating them as observations worth considering. Machiavelli's world was brutal, political, unforgiving. But the principle he identified transcends context. It applies in boardrooms and living rooms, in friendships and in solitude. The principle is this: the world adjusts to whoever appears most settled within themselves. Not the loudest, not the most charming, not the most eager to please, the most settled. The one who does not need the world to agree in order to proceed. The one who states what is true for them and then allows that truth to exist without defense. You begin to see that most explanations are not offered to clarify reality. They are offered to soothe anxiety, your own or someone else's. When you explain, you are often trying to prevent discomfort, trying to ensure that no one walks away confused, upset, or critical. And while this impulse is kind, it is also a trap. Because you cannot control how others feel. You cannot manage their inner experience to the precision of your language. And the attempt to do so only scatters you further. When you stop explaining, you stop trying to manage the emotional weather of every interaction. You state your position, and you allow others to have their response. If they are confused, they can ask. If they disagree, they can say so. But you do not preemptively dismantle their potential discomfort. You do not carry the responsibility for their understanding. And in refusing that responsibility, you free yourself. You stop performing emotional labor that was never yours to perform. This is the quiet revolution that Machiavelli hinted at but never fully articulated. Power is not about controlling others. It is about refusing to be controlled by the need for their approval. It is about recognizing that your legitimacy does not depend on consensus, that your choices do not require a chorus of agreement to be valid, that you can be misunderstood, even disliked, and still remain intact. The final realization comes slowly. It is not a lightning strike. It is a gradual recognition that the person you were trying to convince was never the person across from you. It was yourself. You explained because you wanted to hear your own reasoning spoken aloud, validated by the nods and murmurs of others. You sought understanding because you were not yet sure you understood yourself. But once you trust your own mind, once you believe that your choices are sound, even when they are unexplained, the need to explain evaporates, and in that evaporation something emerges. Not arrogance, not coldness, but a kind of gravitational presence. You become someone who does not argue, because you do not need to. You become someone who does not justify, because your actions speak. You become someone who exists fully in their own decisions, and that fullness is felt by everyone around you. Power, in the end, does not shout. It does not plead. It does not explain. It simply remains, and remaining is enough.